and they have a lot of overlapping projects with Stefan. And she works on issues of related to conceptual foundations at risk and uncertainty, ecological and bounded rationality, and more recently looking at cognition in online environments and AI ethics. So today she will talk about the psychology of disinformation and cognitive tools against online manipulation. Great to have you.
Thank you so much, Michaela, for the introduction and for organizing this lovely workshop it was very inspiring to hear so many different perspectives, but also convergent perspectives. So I guess some things I'm going to say, I can always refer to other talks for confirmation. All right. So in this talk today, specifically, I will talk about the human or psychological side of research on disinformation, and specifically, I will focus on interventions that psychological science develop in order to counteract the challenge of disinformation. All right, so this is an overview of the talk. A lot of this is based on this recent paper that we published with Stefan Lewandowski and Ralf Hertwig, called Citizens versus the Internet, no less. And today, after a brief introduction about our general approach, I will talk about what we know about psychology of deception, and then I will turn then to the types of behavioral and cognitive interventions that can be applied to the digital world, specifically nudging and boosting, and then focus on some examples of boosting tools, and finish with an outlook of a toolbox approach to digital challenges. An important part of our overall approach at the Center for Adaptive Rationality is to always consider both the structures of the environment and the human mind and how they interact. So in this, we follow a tradition of cognitive science that assumes an ecological perspective and takes into account an organism's cognitive abilities as well as its physical and social surroundings. And this work builds on the tradition of Simon's bounded rationality, but also Brunswick's lens model framework, and is probably best known for the study of fast and frugal heuristics from the adaptive perspective. And in this regard, the digital world represents for us a new environment in which people socialize, search information, and make decisions. And since it was launched in 1969 as an ARPANET, the digital world has become the humanity's new home now that more than half of the world population is online. And it is also important to remember that the internet is a very young environment, right? It is just 50 years old, the web is in its 30s, and the social media is basically in its teenage years, if we consider that Facebook was launched just 17 years ago. So it is both quite remarkable how quickly we learned to navigate these environments, but also probably not surprising that we didn't have much time yet to adapt to these new surroundings, and especially to the challenges it represents. So applying this ecological perspective to the digital world, again, it is important to understand both parts of this equation, the mind and the environment, and how they interact. So on the side of the environment, they see a set of characteristics that distinguish online world from its offline counterpart. And these differences are, of course, we believe, consequential for human behavior and cognition. So in our paper, we provide more systematic overview of these differences, paying specific attention to how the environment is different in its structural characteristics, but also importantly, how it's different in terms of how we perceive this environment as being different, right? And just to mention a few important points here is that in the digital world, we have much larger social networks, much bigger amount of information that is accessible at our fingertips, and importantly, and quite which is quite drastically differentiate online world from offline world, it is also adaptive and intelligent. So if in this traditional perspective, we would say, people, human beings, animals adapt to the environments. When it comes to the digital environment, it also can adapt. it also can learn our preferences, it collects data about us, and then very quickly it adapts. So I think it's one probably crucial characteristics that is also represents a challenge for human behavior, of course, because you can adapt to something and then overnight it changes to something else. And then, of course, also importantly, that the power of design and the power of choice architecture online is also quite significant. It's not that it is absent from the physical world, because our physical world now also in many aspects is an artificial environment which is constructed by people, but online these choice architectures again can be redesigned overnight. Just consider how long it takes to redesign the city to make it, for instance, bike friendly. You need to build the new roads, you need to reconstruct the existing roads, but online you can change the default settings just in a couple of clicks, which again sort of goes back to the idea of intelligence and adaptivity. Right. And then what does it mean for the specific challenge of disinformation with which we are concerned in this workshop? A couple of things to mention is online, everything can be a broadcaster this day. There are virtually no entry costs to start sharing messages with the world. People can be anonymous. And there are different social cues and epistemic cues for the quality of information that are present online than the cues that we've been developed for many, many years evolutionary, right? So that again is a tricky part here. And then there are network effects in the spread of online information in general, and how the online networks can become polarized. A lot of interesting research out there on this. Not going to talk about this in this talk, but again, if you consider the environmental side of this equation, it's also very interesting to look at this network effects there. And then, as mentioned already, the online environments offer new tools for computational propaganda, for spreading the false information to masses, and which are amplified by algorithms and even bots sometimes, right? And last but not least, there is a multiplicity of false and misleading information online. It's not just straightforward true or false. There is a lot of ways that people can be misled, unfortunately. And I like how Michel de Montaigne expressed this already in the 16th century, saying that the opposite of truth has 100,000 faces. Even if stating the facts can be quite a matter of just being one thing, if we not consider uncertainty, for instance, but the way the facts can be misrepresented, or how lies can be presented, that there is a multiplicity of ways. And we also observe this with online disinformation and propaganda. Right. So this was very briefly this environmental part. Here, however, today I want to focus on the human part of this equation, on the psychology of disinformation, as promised in the title of my talk, right? And here, this sort of human side of disinformation, there is quite a lot of research already, encouragingly, right? So we have research done by Pennycook and Rand, and by many other people, and Steve Lewandowski here contributed. And we also offered a review of the challenge in our paper and in the GRC report on democracy and technology is also a big part of it. Just couldn't fit it here anymore. Yeah, and there's a lot to say there. Again, I will have to try to be brief as much as possible, but luckily for us, it's already a lot of interesting research, sort of specifying why people fall for disinformation, and most importantly, what can be done with this challenge. I would like to start, however, from more general conceptual perspective, and just remind us that from this normative perspective, truth is regarded as a fundamental epistemic good and goal. In the world of one of philosophers, the epistemic goal is to is that we want our beliefs about the world be correct and to accurately depict the world. Truthfulness also importantly regarded as a moral good in most ethical systems. So in a virtue ethics, you would have, of course, it as a virtue, being a truthful person, right? It's also a universal moral principle in deontological or Kantian ethics, so Kant regarded it as unconditional duty. And moral value of telling the truth and immorality of lying can also be justified from a utilitarian perspective. For instance, saying that holding true beliefs in general leads to some positive utility for an individual and the society, and holding false beliefs can be harmful. We can see this on the example of beliefs about vaccination, for instance, which is pretty obvious. And also, of course, telling the truth is seen as a social norm, and it underpins trust in the social contract and the social partners. So from all epistemic, moral, and social perspective, truth has value. However, if we turn to the other side of this, we see that deception and lies are quite common in everyday life. Some research shown, I didn't quote it here, but I read it quite recently, that on average people lie once or twice a day. Usually it's not a big lies. And as Steve told today, Trump really went above the average with 21 lies per day. Well, I think that this research on psychology of deception is also quite relevant here, because in this train of research, deception is actually defined quite similar to disinformation, right? So it's defined as deliberate attempt to mislead others, much like disinformation is all about deliberate lies. And unsurprisingly, nobody likes to be lied to or deceived or manipulated. People are generally critical of lies, unless the lies are their own, because they never think that they are actually telling harmful lies. And another research also showed that lies that harm others are seen as the least acceptable, and altruistic lies, white lies, as the most acceptable. But people rarely think of themselves as spreading dangerous lies, and also potentially because exposed lies can also harm reputation of a person and, importantly, erode trust. And that's quite a crucial point here that also was mentioned earlier, and that Hannah Arendt beautifully expressed in one of her interviews, that if everybody lies to you, the consequence is not that you believe the lies, but rather that nobody believes anything any longer. And indeed, we see it's not causal evidence now, it's more like trends in the media, that trust in news media continues to fall globally, even though the consumption of news online is growing. And there are, of course, also large partisan effects in politically polarized societies. There are a couple of examples on the right. Then respondents in the survey said that, well, obviously, there are left commie traitors who lie, and the others say, no, it's Fox News that always lies. There's a lot of polarization in perception of lying. And we know how the fake news term itself is misused to target the political opponents, which is actually one of the arguments in some literature, that we as researchers shouldn't use the fake news so much as prefer talking about false news, for instance. And unsurprisingly, of course, social media is perceived as the biggest source of false news and as the least trusted information source. And the recent evidence from Andy Guest, published in PNAS just last month, shows that consequence of consuming partisan news is an erosion of trust in the media. So now it's not about false news, it's just to be exposed to news from different partisan sources, and then you just realize, oh my God, nothing is true, right? Because one person says this thing and another source says the other thing. And the consequence, unsurprisingly, is that you lose trust in the media in general, which is quite concerning. When it comes to detecting deception and accuracy in judging truth, then the results are a bit mixed. If we now step back from the online disinformation to the area of deception, Like part of the research strongly points to the existence of the truth bias, which is again quite an adaptive thing to have, because most of claims in our environment are true, so people in general don't expect lies. And on top of this, people are not that great at detecting deception. So the meta-analysis from 2006 show that just above average, just about chance ability to detect lies. So the authors of the meta-analysis do not dismiss this as a trivial effect, because they say most effects in social psychology are actually not large, but still, I guess we can with confidence conclude that detecting deception is not an easy task for the human mind in general, and that they're expecting the truth from our social partners. And so this meta-analysis was done mostly on studies with younger adults, and then later studies also showed that there are some individual differences, with actually older adults being generally even worse than younger adults in detecting lies, which is a concerning finding, given that we also know that older adults are the ones who consume and share most of false news online. Then, of course, there is this issue of truth versus post-truth. They see that people do see telling the truth as a norm, as a social norm, and they worry about the amount of false information online. From many surveys, unsurprisingly, we would find this. And also in Pennycook et al. Recent study, they saw that 80% of their respondents said that it's important for them to share accurate content online. So despite all the significance of truth in our social world and also in in the media, we at the same time see that there are more and more efforts to undermine the shared reality and relativize the meaning of truth. And I don't have to spend more time talking about this, because we just had this discussion basically, and I was just wanted to add to this the discussion, is that there's also a point of power there, that these lion demagogues, people who tell lies, they also show thereby that they can, they are in a position of power to construct their own reality, and their followers will believe them. And I think this is what we see in many authoritarian countries, that they have enough power to live in their own reality, and they don't care. And I think it's a power move, to be honest. And it sort of reminds me of this epistemological constructivism. And I wonder sometimes, isn't it an artifact of this? And we also see it, unfortunately, in the everyday life, and just routinely people are saying, this is my truth, this is my opinion, whatever you say, this is my facts. So it's not just the politician, it's also cliche in the everyday life. And I wonder what we as scientists and also philosophers of science can do to provide tools to actually sort of counteract this narrative that everybody's entitled to their opinion, without losing, of course, the free speech rights and values. And to add to this picture is that there is a disconnect between accuracy and support. This is what Steve already mentioned, and they have a paper with Briones, Ware, Thompson, nicely entitled "They Might Be a Liar, but They're My Liar." So we see that corrected misinformation attributed to political figures like Trump does not reduce people's feelings of support towards these politicians. And also there's another disconnect between accuracy and sharing. This is one of the most famous findings from Pennycook et al. Is that intention to share content is independent of accuracy. So if we take two conditions independently, like one group would judge accuracy and another group of people would talk about their sharing intentions, that this just completely independent effects. And we also see here that actually people's accuracy is quite good, but I guess it's all really depends on the difficulty of the stimuli, right? If the stimuli are pretty easy to detect, then you would have high accuracy. And if, I guess in the deception studies that were reviewed previously, the the difficulty of the stimuli of the actor lie. So that still doesn't tell us a lot here about how good people actually are. They're good in detecting accuracy in this particular set of stimuli. All right. And in this same account, basically, then these researchers ask why this is happening. They seem to converge, and one of the important answers is that this dissociation is largely driven by inattention, by people not engaging deliberately, not deliberating enough with the content they encounter online. They're sort of in the entertainment mode. They just scroll through their news feeds. They don't stop to think. And another also important point here, not only attention and deliberation matter, but also knowledge, prior knowledge about political or about science, if it's about scientific claims. So this is also important for truth discernment. And of course, this authors also made use of this finding to introduce an intervention, the nudge-like interventions that shifting attention to accuracy subtly on in the experiment or on social networks actually also can reduce people's sharing of misinformation online, which is a hopeful finding. And to add even more to this importance of attention in to sharing and encountering misinformation or disinformation online is another finding by our colleague Philip Lawrence Spren, that actually collective attention on the collective level is shrinking, so that much less and less time is spent on each topic on average. So we see this from both sides, from the individual side and from the collective side. And also theoretically, sort of conceptually, it makes sense if we step back and remember what Herbert Simon said about the attention economy, that a wealth of information, the overabundance of information in the environment would create a poverty of attention, which is a limited resource. And to add another aspect to the psychological sort of profile of people's susceptibility to false information is what Ralph Hertwig likes to call push and hot buttons, right? We're talking here about the role of negative emotions. So for instance, in this famous study showing that false rumors spread faster than true in rumors, they also found that the stories that successfully turned viral were much more likely to inspire fear, disgust, and surprise, whereas true stories triggered anticipation, sadness, joy, and trust. So, and the converging finding is that people were also more likely to retweet messages featuring both moral and emotional language, and the same offers to William Brady in another paper, again comes back to attention, saying that these stimuli, this highly emotional stimuli, they succeed in this competition for attention, which is again, evolutionary speaking, is an adaptive trait to be able to respond to important stimuli from the environment. But in this environment, which is artificially amplifying the stimuli, that is no longer adaptive, right? Which brings us sort of to this picture of these adaptive tools that became vulnerabilities, right? That is limited attention, that's biased towards truth and towards novelty and surprise, and also more attention allocated to emotional stimuli. And we also see here this slightly above chance at detecting deception is probably also something we can think of as vulnerability. But again, it highly depends on the difficulty of the stimuli and the environment itself. And when we think about our strengths, I would again highlight that we humans dislike lies and manipulation. We prefer to share truth and ask about this, that accuracy in judging truth can be improved if attention is in check, and that it's important for societies and for people in general to build trust in social interactions. So on this, at least on the side of values and preferences, we are pro-truth, and our vulnerabilities might be coming from adaptive mechanisms that are not so much adaptive anymore. All right, so how I'm doing with time? Okay, I think I'm good. Right. So, which brings me now to the second part of the talk, which is all about the question how to remedy this challenge of online manipulation and disinformation. And our general perspective, and I'm talking here about my colleagues in this project that Steve Lewandowski is also involved, is that to improve the situation, we should act on both the environmental side by designing better digital architectures and enforcing regulations as necessary, and also on the cognitive and behavioral side, empowering users and fostering digital competences. And I will talk about this second part. But again, in our project, we're sort of concerned about both. And so taking this broader perspective, there are different ways or entry points that we as a society, as scientists, can contribute to this challenge, which includes both law and technology and education, of course, but also we believe that psychological science, cognitive science, has a role to play here. And its role is focused mainly on the behavioral and cognitive tools, so sort of drawing on all the research and knowledge that we have accumulated in cognitive science to design interventions that actually work and test interventions. So it's not just, oh, we think it works, but it actually is tested and proven empirically. Sort of contra what we can see sometimes in what social media networks do themselves. They implement interventions, they claim they work, but we cannot actually verify this in any ways. And so in our paper, we present this overview of different types of interventions coming from psychological and behavioral sciences. So Steve Lewandowski coined his approach as technocognition, which is about designing cognitively inspired technological interventions in information architecture. So basically, for designing interventions that are implemented in the environment based on what we know about human cognition and behavior. And one example would be introducing friction in the sharing of offensive material, based on our knowledge that we know that slowing down and redirecting attention can actually impact people's desire or intention to share something. And this is what Twitter called prompts. I think they actually big fans of friction, which is like prompts to, for instance, ask people to reconsider sharing offensive material, or to maybe not retweet something they haven't read. So I think friction is quite a powerful tool, can also be misused if it's in the wrong hands of authoritarian governments, right? So that, I mean, every tool is a sort of double-edged sword. And then another two interventions, one is nudging, which is very well known, I guess, in behavioral science. It's probably the leading intervention, especially since who was a Teller, one of the leaders in this approach, also got a Nobel Prize for his work. So nudging is very famous, and it's all about redesigning choice architectures. Online, offline, doesn't matter. What you do is you change how the options are presented, so that then you nudge people towards the option that you, as a choice architect, consider the best. And that's another sort of tricky part there, because it's all sort of relies on what policymakers think is the best option. And the sort of the other side of this approach is, of course, nudging is also used by not so well-meaning actors to nudge consumers towards the option that they prefer. And then finally, the third approach that we are mostly working on, so don't be surprised, I'm more positive towards this one. It's called boosting, and it's all about designing cognitive interventions and tools that aim to foster people's cognitive and motivational competences. And why this is also close to research on fast and frugal heuristics is that these tools are meant to be easy to implement. This is the like rule of thumb that you can easily remember and then use. This is also where it's different from education, even though as education, it also aims to foster competences. So for instance, digital literacy. And I'll give you some examples that might become apparent how they differ. And yeah, again, this is sort of distinction between nudging and boosting. Importantly, what nudges does, it acts through choice architecture in order to impact behavior so that you as an actor can even be unaware that this is happening. The important outcome is the behavioral change. Then it comes to boost. The point of entry is cognition, can also be through environment, but what we want to change is people's decision to engage in certain behavior. So this is by necessity is a conscious choice. Then of course there is this category in between, some call it educative nudges or boost. We're talking here about fact check labels, prominent epistemic cues in the environment that also help people to make their decision better. So, right, and I hope it's clear now. So from this more broader approach to behavioral interventions, I'm now moving to boosting tools that we describe in detail in the second part of our paper. And again, sort of in line with this ecological approach, these different tools have to fit both the challenge in the environment and the cognitive capacities involved in this challenge. So we distinguish this broadly two categories of boosting tools. One aims to boost agency and autonomy. Here we would have self-nudging and deliberate ignorance. It's all about redesigning your environment and making choices about your environment that are consistent with your own goals. Sort of drawing also on the knowledge from nudging, but becoming your own choice architect. And another set of tools is about boosting reasoning and resilience to manipulation. This is more broadly known things like decision aids to boost digital literacy or inoculative interventions, which if I have time, looking at my clock, I'll talk very briefly. So these four tools, I will not talk about self-nudging because the challenge it aims to address is more about manipulative choice architectures than disinformation, but I also think it can be applied to this challenge as well. So as my first tool, I would like to start to consider deliberate ignorance or intelligent ignoring, we might also call it as information management tool. That might not be the most obvious thing that you would use, like asking, oh, okay, 30 minutes, good. Thinking, or is this, do you want to promote ignorance? Don't we have enough ignorance online? But it's not about that. We don't want more ignorance. We want to begin with this problem that we have, that there is too much information. Not all information is knowledge. Not all information is truthful or useful for us. And actually, maybe the first skill that we need to learn to deal with this environment is to filter information. Algorithms, of course, do this for us. They also filter information, but not based on our own preferences. So one of these important steps to begin thinking critically and seeking knowledge in the digital world is maybe paradoxically to start ignoring information that strives to get our attention, but maybe is not in line with what we actually want to know. And one example, like from the physical world, would be, how there's the sugary foods that are made in such a way that it's impossible to resist, and the best way is actually not trying to resist them, but not to encounter them in your environment in the first place. And the same with this sort of information that is useless but might be just very appealing to people. That is not to say that we shouldn't completely dismiss entertainment. It's just to say that we should like seriously consider the tool of ignoring information that is not consistent with our goals, right? So this is what we call deliberate ignorance, and there is this paper by Ralph Hertwig and Christoph Engel outlining the importance of choosing not to know in many areas of life. And there's also the new book that is approaching this sort of underrated topic, both in both epistemology or philosophy or decision making, because we came to see knowledge and information as such is valuable in itself, without considering in situation that it actually might be better not to know something. So fascinating topic. And then moving on from this, another set of tools is what we call simple decision aids. In this case, aim to boost digital information literacy. And to give you one example of how it can be converted to boost is based on the research coming from Stanford History Education Group and Sam Weinberg and colleagues. So what they did, they decided to, again, this is evidence-based interventions, importantly. They wanted to develop educational curricula that would help students to reason better about the matters they encounter online. And they decided who better to ask or to observe than professional fact checkers who do this for a living. And indeed, that's what they did. And they found out quite big differences between the groups of people they observed, the fact checkers being the most successful ones in detecting false information or in tracing evidence online. And how they did that is one of the tools, heuristics tools, if you will, they used is the lateral reading strategy, which is basically you're on the source, and instead of actually trying to evaluate the source from what you see in front of you, you leave it and search for evidence on the web. And here's an example from their recent paper. So they present evidence of how students in high school in the US perform on this difficult task, right? So there's this website evaluation task. Then they ask to rate how trustworthy information is, and to give to provide arguments why it might not be so. And actually, like huge majority of students in their nationally represented sample got very low scores on this task, because what they did, they just devoted all their attention to looking at the website itself, saying, look, in their mission statement, they say they're interested in facts, everything looks so well, data, education, everything looks legit, right? But what fact checkers actually do with this kind of information, they leave the website. They first question the legitimacy of the source, and they just Google it, or whatever search engine you use. And very quickly, they find that this website, this organization is a front group for the fossil fuel industry. Of course, you have to have some knowledge of front groups and the industry, so it's not as easy to just Google things. But at the same time, it already in a few seconds provides you more relevant information than whatever amount of time you would spend just trying to evaluate the website as well. And this, importantly, this lateral reading strategy is actually a very simple tool. It doesn't take long to convey the message. And many people, I believe, already use it intuitively. Then they encounter something they have a reason to mistrust. Although that seems to not be the case in this study of high school students. And our idea is that we can actually convert this finding that has been validated in educational settings times and times again to very simple intervention, like a lateral reading boost that just tells people, if you encounter information that is from a source you've never heard about, or you have reason to doubt it, this is not trusted information, trusted source, then the best thing you can do is to leave the source and just to search about it. This strategy is not without its downsides, of course, and we can talk about this. And yeah, this is just to show that it also can be made embedded in the web's posts, and this is something this is not tested yet. Lateral has a lot of evidence behind it in educational settings, but this is also something we aim to test eventually in our project. And then another tool, which I will very briefly mention to you, is inoculation that aims to boost resilience to misinformation and the tactics of disinformation. Online, again, has been widely, I guess, distributed in terms of the games, like bad news games from Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab, and also has good results, especially for people who tend to believe, to be led on by certain disinformation strategies from the beginning. I will not spend a lot of, because I don't have time, if you have questions, we can talk about this later. All this is to say that now we have at our disposal quite a few tools that have evidence behind them. And of course, this is just the beginning, because what we really need is to all come together and design the tools and test them and see what works and what doesn't. So our approach to this is that not necessarily boosts are better or nudges are better, that we have to consider them as a toolbox that addresses different challenges and also maybe different groups of people with different, considering individual differences such as age. Yes, and this is what we also trying to do in our project, Reclaiming Autonomy, and what we outlined in some of our publications. And with this, I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. That was fascinating, and we're moving towards solutions, so that's great. That's wonderful. So the floor is open for questions. Please add your question in the chat, and we'll take them in turn. Let's see. Did I? Okay. I'm not missing anything. Do I have my chat? Yes. So, Eric.
Hi, Anastasia, and hi, Mal. I'm sorry, I had some serious internet problems. The first time all year, I've been teaching and giving talks, and it had to go down. So I missed a short part of your talk, but I really appreciate it. And I want to ask how much you think this picture of misinformation in the social media context introduces what Barbara Herman has called new moral facts, right? So Herman thinks it's fairly rare, but we actually encounter moments where sort of the normal set of concepts that we have available in moral and political thought kind of gets exhausted, and we actually encounter something genuinely novel. And it struck me that in some ways you're trying to make that case, that the work, say, we have on conspiracy theories outside of social media, that goes back to the paranoid style of American politics and that sort of thing, you just kind of applied that work to this social media setting. I think I take it to put a lot of the findings together, something would be fundamentally missing on your picture. And so what, is there a way to kind of bring out what is particularly novel here on your picture? Obviously, it's going to be diversity of answers, but I think that would be really useful. And because, we just had a couple books that have come out on conspiracy theories, but they generally haven't taken the social media space as seriously as you have. And so I'd love you to speak to that.
So you mean what novelty can considering social media bring to our knowledge about conspiracy theories or?
The problems it presents, for moral problems, they could be political, so problems for democracy, problems for the way we relate to each other as equals. You can kind of pick the space where there might be potential new moral facts that are created here, that are fundamental problems that can't be tackled with the available concepts. But I thought you were effectively making a good case for that. I don't want to project that on you.
Yeah, maybe I'm not sure if I completely understand what you mean. Can you maybe expand a little bit on this? Because I feel like I'm missing something here.
Sure. I mean, think of all the ways that people were manipulated before social media in a, say, political setting. And obviously there is considerable moral abuse that could happen in actual gatherings and letter writing, yellow journalism, where there's, the charge of not fake news, but something like that was lively. And then I'm just asking, in the tech context, in the context of social media, how fundamental is that shift? Is it just more manipulation, but the same fundamental kind, or do we have something new here? And that's what I meant by the kind of new moral facts.
I see. I think I talked about this in a more broad way of any sort of information and disinformation specifically, but when it comes to conspiracy theories, I mean, I guess there's one trivial answer to your question, that everybody would probably say that the social media and the online world brings the scope to the problem, right? That even if before conspiracy theories would be relatively small communities of people joining together, that due to the internet and its power, the communities of people who can share false beliefs and reinforce each other in these false beliefs are becoming much bigger. So if before it would be some lonely guys in tinfoil hats, as Steve said, now they can connect. The message can be proliferated. They can, like in Germany, we see this Querdenker movement, right? Which has become, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the way how big it becomes is entirely due to the ability to convey the message to most people. And of course, most people will not believe it ever. But in this majority, just statistically, you would achieve much more success if you just trans. And then, of course, there are all these ways to manipulate the public. Like in the offline world, to lie, there's all this research on cues of deception, how people detect deception, even if they're not great at that. In general, all these cues matter nothing in the online world. You would say, oh, liars would usually, like the true stories would be much more elaborated, would have more facts in them. And if you are on Twitter, how much elaboration can you get there? So all these traditional cues towards veracity also don't matter much anymore. And indeed, like this completely fringe media that can exist, even if it's removed from the mainstream platforms, and can always find the ways through the fringes of the internet and still gain people's attention. So I'm not saying anything new here, but I do think that there's a lot of amplification and a lot of space that internet offers for both good and dubious causes.
Right. I see Jenny and I saw Stefan. Was there any fingers, Stefan? If not, I think Jenny was in line, and then you, and then Alessandra.
Yeah, I think Jenny and actually Alessandra as well.
Yeah. Jenny, please.
Hi, I was really interested in the finding that older people are less good at detecting lies, and I wanted to ask for a little clarification on that. Was that specifically about online lies, or was that offline as well?
No, it was a two strain of research. So one is coming from psychology of deception, and it's not online. And they just sort of tested this finding from the meta-analysis, which was done mostly on young people, college students, what have you, in typical psychological experiments. And they decided to bring this to the more realistic samples, and then they found that older adults are worse in detecting deception than somebody lies to you. And it's concerning with another finding that we have from Greenberg et al., Guess et al., and many others who analyzed the activity on Twitter and Facebook before the 2016 presidential election in the US, and saw that even though they say that it was a very small percentage of fake news that was shared online, and the distribution of attention to fake news and the shares of fake news was very skewed towards the minority of people. And then it comes to individual differences, most of them were conservative and older. So that's
I mean, I can see quite easily why older people would be less good at detecting falsehoods online because they have less experience with that medium. It's not as natural to them and that sort of thing. It seems really counterintuitive that older people would be less good at detecting lies face to face since they have just a lot more human experience. Is there an explanation for why that would be? That is popularly accepted?
Not as far as I am aware. And this is like, this is very good paper, actually two good papers, Aging in the Era of Fake News and Judging Truth, but Aging in the Era of Fake News by Nadia Brashear. Where she reviews, like she addresses this question, why older people might actually be worse at detecting false news as it seems, and there are many ways to explain this. And this, the fact that they might be—
the alarm is going off?
that might be worse in detecting deception is just one potential explanation. But there are others, like actually she dismisses cognitive declines. There are also strengths in older people, like they are more experienced, they have more knowledge, importantly. And as we know, topic relevant knowledge is important for detecting falsehoods as well. But they also have more trust in people. I think that's probably one of the things that might be connected to this finding. They just trust people more. And that's why their truth bias is even higher than in younger people. And that might—
Thanks very much.
Right, so I'm not sure who was first, if Stefan or Alexandra. If any of you would like to go ahead, please.
I think it was Alessandra. But
Okay.
I'm not.
Okay.
Thank you. In which case, I'll go ahead. I would thank you, first of all. Really, really interesting. I've learned a lot from it. So thank you. I was interested in a claim you made at the beginning and how then that links to boosting. So you said, and I think you are right, that a feature of the internet is that, or the web in general, digital life, is that it adapts to our behavior much more quickly than on online environment. So for instance, search engine algorithms have changed given that we started using them to ask questions rather than finding a site, for instance. And so the architecture itself and the algorithm changed to adapt to our behavior. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about how, if people start using your boosting techniques, that might actually change the environment they work in, and whether you think it might change it for the better so that people themselves need to be less boosted, or whether you think it might change it for the worse insofar as people need to have even bigger boosts to deal with the changing environment, given that Facebook and these other corporations are driven by the profit motive rather than the truth motive.
It might, though, I think. And actually one example, which I didn't mention because I was just trying to finish quicker, is about the lateral reading, right? Which seems to be such an intuitively good strategy, and like you unsure Google it. But then there is this notion I recently learned about of data voids, right? That if you there are certain keywords in search that are occupied, but let's say not so well-meaning actors, so that if you they use this keyword strategically, for instance, to spread misinformation about vaccination or whatever is in their interest. And then if you start Googling these particular keywords, you would come to the results that are skewed towards false information rather than what you actually want to see there. So, and this shows adaptivity in a certain way of this malicious strategies, how they use the environment. But it's not so much the environment itself, it's the actors who use the environment and thereby change the environment in this ways. So yeah, and then of course there is just this arm race, right? You know, the more tools and cognitive vigilance people might have, the more ways the platforms would find to optimize their goals. Because if their goals is to make you click on ads, and then you developed a resistance based on, for instance, this research on micro-targeting, right? Then they would just find better ways to target you, and then you would have to find better ways to detect manipulation. So there's this point that is, of course, a point of concern for any strategy. That's why I think it's not enough, it's never enough to just act on the cognitive side, because the other side would have much more resources in its disposal so that's why regulations are necessary. You know, we have to also act collectively and decide what is important for us, and then act on this. So yeah, no, definitely that's the tricky part here.
Great. So now we have Stefan.
Oh yeah, well, it was more of a comment rather than a question, if I may. And it's in reply to, I think it was Eric who was asking, well, what's different now? You know, we've always had all sorts of things happening. One of the things I want to throw in there is that there is a whole issue of social signaling and cues that are systematically distorted online that you could never achieve in reality without social media. And that takes a multitude of forms, but let me give you the simplest form. And I don't think you mentioned this, Anastasia, correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, if my favorite example is the village idiot in Gloucestershire in the 19th century who thought that the world was flat. Now, whenever he opened his mouth and expressed that view, everybody he ever met in his life would have said, oh, come on, you know, have another beer or something, go away. And there was just, because you never meet anybody else in real life who holds that outlandish opinion. Now, the moment you go on Facebook today, that's no longer the case, because it doesn't matter what you believe, you will always find an epistemic community online, even if it's you know, only 100 people in the world and they're dispersed all over all 5 continents. And that has psychological consequences, because we know that people's beliefs are entrenched to the extent that they think they're shared by others. So the social epistemic aspect of beliefs is crucial and underappreciated. And so, in other words, what's happening now is that somebody who picks up some bizarre conspiracy theory that no one else in their neighborhood, physical neighborhood, believes, and he would never meet another person ever walking down the street who believes that, they'll find 1,000 people online. And they will think, oh, everybody else believes that as well. It must be true. And that sort of hooking up and then becoming resistant to persuasion, that is something that social media offers that, to my mind, is qualitatively different from anything we had previously in real life, because you just can't do it in real life. And that's only one problem. Now, there is a multitude of other consequences that are similar, which have something to do with the network structure, which can fool you into thinking that you know, more people believe something than is actually the case, simply based on the way in which the networks are structured or connected. There's all these, you know, interesting network effects that emerge in social media that you, again, wouldn't get in reality. And to my mind, they're underexplored and underappreciated. But that would be my answer to Eric's question.
Yeah.
One of the answers.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Steve, indeed, yeah, that's a very good answer. And also I wanted to reinforce this idea, you know, like the social media, it drives this idea of popularity and followers, and that you have to be embedded in some social circle there. It again connects to the idea that whatever reality you construct, and if you have followers that believe in this reality, gives you some sort of power in this world. And that again reinforces you to construct these realities that you share with other people. Which you cannot do so easily in the normal life. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I guess also the effect of echo chambers. And so we have a final question from Christoph. And
yeah. So on that note, Anastasia, I was wondering whether we don't, in addition to sort of building people's competence in what to share and what not to share, it's not also important to sort of wane them off the addiction to likes. Because like you said, like a lot of people are sort of, they expect that their friends will see what they post, and friends in like Facebook friends sort of terminology. I mean, the easiest thing would be for those companies to make those companies just remove the like system entirely, and that robs them of the whole profiling ability. Then they're not going to do that. But people get very much addicted to the like system.
Yeah, and to the whole popularity game it drives. Yeah, I saw this very nice analysis done by, I don't remember, New York or Washington Post, New York Times. They followed accounts of people who became conspiracy theorists during the pandemic, and just looking at their tweets before they started tweeting crazy stuff, and they're like, oh, 1, 2 likes, nothing exciting. And then they started saying, but maybe this pandemic is actually introduced by Chinese specifically to target American. I don't know. I don't remember what crazy things they were tweeting, and immediately they saw increase of likes and of popularity of their post. And that, of course, in turn has driven them to post more and more on this and reinforce their beliefs they probably weren't that motivated to have in the first place. So that's also an interesting aspect. And yeah, on likes or shares, retweets, all this information embedded in the tweets is definitely important. And a colleague of mine, Philip Lawrence-Spran, is a big fan of thinking about how we can design feedback about the information shared online that is actually informative and helpful, instead of driving this sort of craziness of just gaining more followers and more likes online. Yeah, definitely, I think there is something to think about there.
Yeah. I was also thinking in terms of like waning people off the addiction. I mean, there are these new apps for like study and productivity, which are basically just blocking your smartphone. And then they have like a reward system oftentimes. So the longer you don't use your phone, it kind of gives you like a virtual reward for. There's one app where they say like the longer, like for every hour you don't use your phone, they plant so many trees or something. There's something connected to it. But I was thinking whether in terms of the nudging and the boosting, you could sort of imagine things of a similar nature for Facebook. So sort of like Netflix, when it gives you that prompt of, are you still watching? Facebook could be, by policymakers, be required to sort of say, if you've logged on Facebook 5 times today, it's supposed to give you a prompt that says, you shouldn't be on here. Like just...
Well, the smartphone do that, like Apple does that for you, right? You can start to have this feature that I like, if I spend more time on Instagram and I want to, then I have set, so it reminds me about it. So definitely, and actually in our paper, we call this self-nudging, that you can, it sort of falls into the idea of how you can organize your environment using technology in a way that nudges you towards where you want to be. Maybe you want to spend all your time watching Netflix, and that's fine if it's your goal, right? But if you said to yourself, no, actually my goal right now is to spend that amount of time on social media or whatever, and then that amount of time on something else, you can then use these tools to your advantage. So I agree, that's definitely helpful.
Self-nudging. I mean, the problem with addiction always is getting the people who don't realize they're addicted or don't want to admit it to themselves that they are addicted.
Yeah, that's usually first step in addressing. But actually, it's sort of in line with the research on addiction and how you one of the way or research informing good habits is that you don't try to resist these urges, but you actually remove them from your environment. The stimuli that trigger you, they should not be in your proximity. And that's the best way to deal with it. It's not the way to exercise superhuman ability to resist every single thing. I don't think, it's just like there's research on that's not what works against addiction.
And it doesn't have to be everything every time. It's just about breaking the habit. Oftentimes that's enough to, like you said, self-nudging. I like that term. It's very fitting. Yeah.
There is a paper on this.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for the lively discussion. So that leaves us only with 5 minutes for the break. So thank you again, Anastasia, for a wonderful talk.